Awesome. Okay, great. So here we are, our steering committee meeting for the Vermont Climate Council. Thanks, everyone. Um, I just dropped in the chat our agenda. It is, by all accounts, a very light agenda. So let's see how we do. Um, and can even share my screen with it if that's helpful. But what we're trying to do today, um, well, let's go. Um, we've got some housekeeping of minutes, actually two sets of minutes. We've got housekeeping on confirming appointments, subcommittees. And then we need to talk about what else are we going to use these spaces for, this steering committee space for going forward? Because right now we didn't really have anything um, more substantive to talk about. If we want to use the full 20 minutes, great. If we don't, that's fine too. A little public comment and we finish up. So that's what we have on deck today. Any quick questions about our agenda, knowing that the biggest part of our agenda is talking about how to use future meetings? Any questions? Okay. All right. So why don't we do housekeeping of the minutes? I'll give folks a second to click through if you haven't seen them. It's two months worth of minutes there.
I appreciate the new accessible format of the minutes
Hmm.
Great.
and that work.
Yeah, it makes it easier.
Awesome. Anybody need more time? Anyone, a second? Okay. Any concerns with the minutes? All right. Super. Let's treat them as approved. Thanks so much. Okay. Then we have some appointments. Um, and Liz, do you want to just say a word about that? Who's going where?
Yeah. So this is Jackie to cross-sector mitigation and Stephanie to rural resilience and adaptation. These are two climate counselors' appointments to subcommittees.
And those are of their choosing, right? Liz?
Correct. Yeah, this is what they're interested in.
Yeah. You all as a steering committee have sort of the final sign off on that. Any questions or concerns about those? All sounds good. Yeah. All right. Oh, hang on one second, Julie. You're on mute.
I don't
There we
know,
go.
Liz, if you have it handy. Is it possible just to pop up the list of what counselors are on what subcommittees right now? I know in the past we've ended up with a little bit of uneven distribution. And not to say I don't want to give people their choices, but just to make sure we're aware.
Yeah, I'll grab that link in a moment.
Okay. Um, okay. Um, I'm pretty sure that rural resilience has not been a place of like oodles of counselor uh, attendance, but it would be helpful to see Liz's chart.
Yeah, agreed.
Okay. So as Liz is pulling that up, let's put a pin on the sort of official yes on that while we wait for that. The other thing for us to talk about today is how we want to use these meetings going forward. Um, we had talked about doing monthly steering committee meetings. I think all of you were felt that was the right move. Um, and so for when we think about next month and the following month, uh, I'm just curious if we could do a little brainstorming here about how to use your time wisely and what is it that you'd feel most compelled by for these meetings. I can say from my end, clearly a meeting prior to a council meeting is about setting up the agenda, right? That's been a primary role for you all. That'll happen once a quarter. And so the meeting prior to a council meeting is about that agenda setting. Um, there'll be two other meetings, right, that are kind of not so much about that, and per quarter. So that's sort of where my head goes is like, what's the best use of you all's time? What am I not thinking about, or that you be find particularly compelling for these monthly meetings? So that's the conversation I want to have. Love to hear your thoughts on it, um, and so that we can be planning ahead of time and trying to get these agendas set up correctly. Jared?
Um, Thanks, David. I agree that the kind of primary purpose of us of the steering committee meetings immediately preceding climate council meetings makes sense to be those agendas, discussing the agendas for the upcoming council meetings and going through the details and making sure that's all set. But I I do think it, now that we have a little bit more space and time, could also be useful to use the meeting, kind of the steering committee meeting, two meetings ahead of the council meeting, to
Mm-hmm.
just surface potential topics or themes, even if we don't go into detail on what the council agenda would be.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think if we have some time today, we could revisit what we've already discussed for the June meeting and say, is that still what we think? Is there anything that we want to add? Many things, they don't take more than a month to prepare, but if we want to invite outside presentations or ask for updates, it can be helpful to provide more of a heads up to the folks that we'd be asking to do those things. So I think going forward, it probably makes sense to just have like a check-in about the agenda for the next council meeting as a standing item on each of our steering committee meetings, and we can just go into more or less depth depending on where we are in that timeline.
Got it. Okay. Make that a standing item. I think that sounds really smart. Thanks, Jared. Folks feel good about that. I saw mostly nodding when that was happening. Okay. So that's one standing item, even if you're not right before a meeting. And we could even do a little bit of that today. Yeah. Other thoughts? Are there other things you could imagine that are milestones or things connected to the climate action plan where it'd be helpful for you all as a group to like have some awareness or provide some
Yeah.
input or I don't know.
I mean, just one thought would be inviting members of the steering committee, and then, I mean, others, like if there are big, state policy changes, federal policy changes, updates, like on things like that would be relevant to the Climate Council, just that the steering committee could help keep abreast of that, and that those kinds of things could potentially inform a full Climate Council conversation.
Mm. Do you have something in mind, Joey, of like how
Well,
that might
like,
happen
is
this
there
year?
anything at the end of the legislative session that would be relevant for
Hmm.
Climate Council to be aware of? There's the resilience implementation strategy, in different phases of implementation. Like, just there are big efforts afoot in state agencies at the state level, and clearly things change very rapidly right now at the federal level. And I know, you know, there are leaders keeping abreast of that. Just, I think that just making sure that we're staying attuned to things that are happening and that the steering committee could help be a vehicle for identifying those opportunities.
Hmm. How does that
Just a
sound?
thought.
I'm curious, folks from like Julie and Sarah as well from the state side. Can you imagine, this being a good forum to like give folks an update of like what's going on with the implementation of the RIS or the, other things that are going on. So there's a sense of like everybody's plugged in to what's happening.
Yes, I just a little bit of caution, largely drawn from my experience with the Lake Champlain Basin program, where the executive committee can quickly become like a mini steering committee meeting, and then but then that doesn't obviate the need to update the entire steering committee. And so I just think we need to be careful about, like, we can provide maybe emergent updates here, but I think more significant updates should really go to the steering committee. But happy to sort of, if there's a standing item around emergent issues, I think that that makes sense because Joey's point's well taken. Things do change rapidly, particularly at the federal level right now.
Right.
And maybe it really all rolls into Jared's initial thoughts in that we have conversations here to flesh out future topics for the full steering committee. And, we can bring topics here as just maybe a preliminary discussion to have more fully fleshed out with the full steering committee.
Right. Or full council. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right. So I guess what I'm hearing is help me out here. The basic core of your work as a steering committee is to prep up the full council meetings. That's a more obvious thing the meeting prior. However, you can start to do that in the other meetings as well. It would be helpful as you're doing that to get some, briefings on emergent issues or things that are going on. And maybe that's state government. And so, Secretary Moore and Secretary Clark are doing a lot of that briefing, but maybe it's other things too, right? And we'll figure out what that looks like. And the word of caution is let's not be super duplicative. So we're having like all these briefings for you all, but then we have to do it all over again for the council. So that's the word of caution. Okay,
I just want
Kelly?
to be, I
Yeah,
wasn't suggesting briefings for us, just that we would start to flag things that we would brief the full council on. That's
got
what I
it.
was suggesting.
Okay, I think that sounds really aligned with what others are saying. Thanks, Joey. Kelly?
Um, talking about, and one of our jobs is to appoint people to the subcommittees or confirm appointments and all of that.
Mhm.
And I recall there's like a natural moment where everybody's going to be
Mm,
reevaluated for their term on the subcommittees. And I don't remember when that is, but that's just something that I
October.
think October, is that when it is? Okay. So, just something to be aware of. And if there's anything we should be doing to like recruit or follow up or confirm, or I don't know like what our role other than just rubber stamping or raising issues if we see any we have there, but that would be something to keep our eyes on.
mm. That is a really good point. And I wonder, I don't know, Liz, if you have spoken internally with Jane and others about the sort of strategy for that moment in October and what's going to happen?
For subcommittee members, we've discussed January 2027 as that moment of recruitment.
Okay.
That's what I was remembering. I
Yeah.
think October is when terms are up for the appointees from the Senate. So like for me and Jared and the rest of our
I see.
cohort.
Okay. Yeah, I don't
That's
have
probably what Jared was thinking of. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, so for the subcommittee, so that's a ways out, the January time. But if there's anything that leading up to that, we should be as a steering committee helping with or being informed about or whatever. That would just be another thing that might come up later on.
Hmm. Certainly into the fall and those final meetings in the fall where you're thinking about that transition in the new year. Right. Okay. And what does that mean also for appointees being up from the Senate in October? I'm not sure I've paid attention in the past. Has that been something where there's usually been a big turnover, or is that sort of more typically been a continuity moment?
Usually in advance of that date, counselors who are appointed by the Senate Committee on Committees will be in touch with one or all members of that committee. Sometimes it's staff for those appointing authorities to, express whether or not they're interested in serving another term. And if they are, say that and ask to be considered to be reappointed for another term, or if they're not, um, to say that so that the Committee on Committees can go through a process to identify new folks. But it's certainly not automatic.
Okay.
Sorry, Kelly, please add
Oh,
anything.
yeah, and I recall, and obviously it's not like it's, thousands of people, so we can look at it and statistically we're going to expect this many people. But last time I feel like we had about half step down, and then everyone who wanted to continue was reappointed by the Committee on Committees. But that'll be something also just to know that that is coming up. So the steering committee will also want to be thinking about that as like if we have new council members,
Yeah.
finding subcommittees for them and that kind of thing.
Right. And how to onboard them.
Mhm.
Okay.
Because I think we'll have at least some, just statistically. Which I said we can't do, but there we go.
Hmm. Okay. Great. So what I'm capturing here is fundamentally about prepping council meetings. We use all these meetings for that, and we can flag issues that we think would be particularly important, that we want to sort of wrap our minds around. And as we get later in the year, we have this issue of the Senate turnover, and then into January of the big subcommittee turnover. We'll be thinking about that. Okay. That's all really helpful. Anything else in on this topic, and then we'll circle back to Liz's chart. Anything else? Okay. All right. So Liz, were you able to find that chart?
Yeah, I shared that in the chat. I'm also
Oh,
happy
you shared
to
it in the
share my
chat?
screen as well if that's helpful. I just
Format's a little different than it used to be.
okay.
So ag and ecosystem, if I'm looking at this correctly, are you sharing your screen? Right. So ag and eco has one counselor on it. Is that right?
Um, yes.
Cross sector has one, two, three, four, five, six, seven. Just transitions has two. And rural resilience has one, two, three. Science and data has one, two, three. So we have a real challenge in ag and ecosystems.
Yeah, I agree. And part of I think in trying to find balance is it puts a lot of pressure then on Jael to stay as co-chair, right? Because there's no one else that can do it or anyone else who's even participating in the conversations that can help,
Yeah.
would be my concern.
Yeah,
And I feel like,
having been in that position on just transitions until very recently, I can say, yeah, it's a little bit of a concerning position to be in. So I would say if there is a better fit, maybe it's not the two newly appointed people, but maybe somebody else has some interest or expertise in that area and would be willing to move over or
Yeah.
add a subcommittee. You could be on more than one.
because especially with the folks that, we're considering today, there's a clear linkage between the role they're being appointed to or the seat, the description of the seat that they're being appointed to in those subcommittees. And I think we want to kind of honor the expertise, experience, and interest of the folks in those seats with the most closely fit subcommittees. And it feels like there's some committees where there can be quite a bit of closeness or overlap between issues that they're focusing on. It's just the kind of primary lens through which they're looking is slightly different. But, I imagine that a lot of people who are on rural resilience and adaptation, um, you know, might otherwise consider being on ag and ecosystems.
Yeah.
But
And there should be a little star by Ryan's name, right? So it's
as
actually
a
two.
designee,
Yeah. I'm
yeah.
not sure how we do that normally, but I think it's typical we would do that.
I mean, I think Ryan is Anson's like overall designee, right?
Yeah.
To the
So
council.
so I think a star is appropriate there.
Yeah.
Okay, so if I'm hearing you all, it's, for these folks, they have a particular interest. The two folks that are, you know, we're dealing with right now have a particular interest in these areas. And in fact, their seat has a particular correlation with those areas, so it makes sense. Um, this could be a conversation for later in the year. And I think, as you all have said, the subcommittees like Ag and Eco have not a lot to do this year except sort of stay attuned, stay abreast, maybe join in on council meetings. And so it's not so much of a thing this year, right? However, this gets back to our last conversation as we get towards the end of the year. Think about what the work is in 2027. Think about how the subcommittees are going to have some natural rotation because of the ends of appointments. Um, that's when probably you're going to need to have this bigger conversation about balance. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. With that, do you all as a steering committee give your thumbs up to the two appointments that are on the agenda? Yeah? Any concerns about that beyond what we've just talked about?
I have one other question, which is probably for Liz, which is, are there counselors that currently aren't serving on a steering committee besides Secretary Clark, which I know had been a decision around the Secretary of Administration early on?
Yes, Will from Capstone just said he didn't have capacity right now to serve on a subcommittee, and he's a climate counselor.
And that's the only one, Liz.
Or yeah.
Okay. Okay. Are you
Yeah.
all comfortable sort of holding this thought about balance until later in the year as you're thinking about 2027 and sort of getting into the work of 2027? Is that okay to sort of put a pin in this for now? Okay. Great. Okay, so we talked about what the priority of your work will be this year. We can capture that in the notes. We gave approval for the subcommittee appointments. We approved our minutes. That's all that we had on our agenda, except for public comment. Anything else do we need to do here before we go to public comment?
I would just note, going back to this question of a look ahead to the next council meeting, I don't know, I have a recollection that we've discussed this in broad strokes before. Um, so if that is available, that would be great to just like look at together briefly. But I do think it would be helpful again if it's June 22nd to do kind of an end of session update overview. It would be helpful to hear from folks who are regularly working in or following the legislature, like Secretary Moore, like Joey. There are probably others. Maybe Chris is doing stuff on the resilience side. Maybe Secretary Clark can talk about on the budget side, although I imagine whatever configuration. I just think, the folks who are most in the know and most active, it would be helpful to just have a set of updates with relation to the Climate Council and the Climate Action Plan and its recommendations. And
Okay.
then I think also if there are um, key updates related to information that we're tracking that's really relevant to us, that would be helpful. I know that ANR, for instance, has previously set a target of an annual release date for the greenhouse gas inventory and forecast of the spring, but it sounds like there may be challenges with some federal data sets. Regardless of where things stand, it would be helpful to have an update on where they stand and what the projected timeline is. And I'm sure there are probably other kind of key data points or reports that would be useful as updates as well.
Okay. Great. That makes sense to folks. Have those two things for June thinking about, and we can talk obviously more in our next meeting, but for sure some sort of update and some on ledge, some update on data. Okay, that sounds great. So why don't we do a quick public comment moment then? Matthew, good to see you.
Good morning, climate counselors and so forth, and members. Yes, I think that Jared's right about some of the stuff I'm thinking. I didn't think about. I think to add on top of that. I think we should have for your time for the steering committee, have the subcommittee chairs, all of them, come together one at a time just for updates, from our group, but also vice versa what do you need more from our group or our, subcommittee chairs to make this more efficient? So like I said, like I agree with Jared too as well about that updates. How can the subcommittee chairs, you know, help you as a steering committee, but vice versa, we can have that information so we all can work, become, not only work together more efficiently, but also making sure that the message that we're reading from the steering committee or and from the climate council is heard correctly as it's being said. Thank you.
Thanks, Matthew. Appreciate that. Okay. Anything else? I'm not seeing other people on the call except
Yeah,
maybe
I just want to pause to say thanks for that, Matthew. And I think it's a good reminder that in the past, there have been times when, I mean, of course, every steering committee meeting is open to every counselor and subcommittee member and member of the public. But there have been times when we've intentionally said um, that we want to give an extra invitation to subcommittee chairs. And given, the lighter schedule that we have envisioned for this year, I don't think that'll make sense a lot of the time. But if we, pass a point where a number of subcommittees have met and it would be helpful for them to hear updates from each other and steering committee and vice versa, as Matthew said, I think that that's a good idea to kind of keep in our back pocket that we may want to dedicate a steering committee meeting to invitations and updates to subcommittee chairs. But I don't think that we're going to be meeting enough that it makes sense to do that like every couple of months, but maybe, once or twice a year.
right. And maybe in preparation, if you wanted subcommittee chairs to do something at a council meeting,
Yeah.
right? Have them come by and then figure it out together what you'd want them to do at the council meeting.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that's it. Anything else, folks, before we finish up?
That's
Okay, great. Take care, everyone. Have a great week.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
All the best. Bye-bye.